Hi Year 12, so this is Thursday's lesson for both groups on building on those ideas that we just introduced last time in terms of the evolutionary theory of psychology, of attachment specifically I should say. So the first thing I want you to do is this retrieval task. You've done similar things many times before, but this is just a recap of what we already know about some of these behavioural theorists from our previous topic, plus some of those names that we've come up against so far in our attachment topic. So, as always, devil's in the detail, as much detail as you can remember. Why might Glasgow be on there? What does that link to? What study have we looked at? So over to you on that one. Pause this and give it your best shot to retrieve all of that knowledge. So when you've done that, I would suggest that you use your knowledge organisers, both from the approaches topic and from the attachment topic, to just green pen and add and see where your gaps are. I'm going to just focus in my review on those ones which link to our attachment topic so far, because they're the ones you're less likely to be absolutely secure in. They're not yet secured in your long-term memory. So Bowlby is obviously the big name that we need to understand in terms of evolutionary explanations of attachment. So I'm not going to talk about him at length now because I'm moving on to that. And that's the name that we think about when we hear evolutionary explanation of attachment. We should think Bowlby. There's a series of letters we should also think, but that's coming next. The image there, you should have thought of Harlow's monkeys, and then immediately that research that you were looking at, I would want to see words on there like rhesus monkeys, which is the name of the particular species of monkey that he used, lab experiment, surrogate mother. Remember, we had the wire surrogate mother and we had the cloth surrogate mother. The wire one released milk, the cloth one didn't, but clearly provided comfort. I'd want to see words like distress on there, because one of the interesting things we know from Harlow's monkeys was the level of distress that these monkeys were experiencing because they had been separated from their mother. So we would talk about that separation distress or anxiety. And we know that one of the findings that, of course, Harlow discovered from that is the monkeys were choosing comfort over food. So we can use that as a contradiction, as a challenge to that learning theory that says it's all about food. And then Lorenz, and this is just our most recent work that you did on Monday or Tuesday, depending on where your lesson fell. And Lorenz, we know, work with the geese, the goslings, the baby geese, imprinting, found that those infants, although albeit a different species, imprinted, they took the image of the first moving object that they saw, which in this case was Lorenz himself, the researcher, and they almost imprinted that onto their mind. It created, we often use the term a blueprint, almost like a template in there, internalized for all later attachments. So very strangely, these goslings attached and therefore followed and looked to Lorenz as being their attachment figure, because he was the first moving thing that they saw. Now, we know humans are way more complex and very different to goslings, but Lorenz's research was the beginnings of evolutionary theory on this, because it made us think that that initial period, the first attachments that an infant might form, is critical. And that term critical period, used both by Lorenz and later by Bowlby, is really important to this evolutionary idea that we have this critical period in which we need to form an attachment, otherwise it's going to have negative consequences. And we'll come back to that. Meltzoff and more we've looked at more recently. Reciprocity, interactional synchronicity, these are the words I would be expecting to see. And then the rest, apart from the Glasgow image, the rest obviously linked to your previous learning, Bandura, social learning theory, Garcia, classical conditioning, Pavlov, of course, Pavlov's dogs. Glasgow, though, should have made you think, and we're trying to form those connections, develop our schema. Glasgow should have made you think Schafer and Emerson, longitudinal study, stages of attachment. And you may well have listed those stages of attachment on there. So we had the asocial, the indiscriminate, the specific, and then the multiple, 4 stages of attachment spanning between birth, newborn, and around about 18 months old. And of course, then it continues, you have multiple attachments. Okay, so make sure when I've reviewed that, you're thinking, oh, didn't know that, haven't got those details, you know what to do. You go back to your readings, you go back to your knowledge organizer, you create those flashcards, and you continue to self-test yourself till you've got those details absolutely nailed on. Okay, so main focus for today then is really getting to the bottom of this evolutionary theory and what Bowlby had to say. Now, I left you last lesson reading the textbook pages that gave us that overview, that introduction to Bowlby's evolutionary theory. Now, the way I've always taught this and always found it helpful and effective, and the students have always had this to sort of cling on to as a memory aid, is essentially an acronym. And some students a number of years ago, they came up with SMACKY. Now, I know it's not a real word, but it's kind of memorable. It makes some people think about smacking somebody, or it sort of seems to stick. And each of those letters represents a really important element of Bowlby's evolutionary theory. So we'll go through each of those and unpack them and make sure you understand what he meant by those things. And what you're going to see is that a lot of the language I'm using links to that language that you guys came up with when I said to you, right, what words come to mind when you hear the word evolution? You were all typing furiously into your conversation. You were typing in things like adaptation, survival, innate, the idea that we've inherited these, that we've passed them on to the next generation, these traits, these behaviours. Well, you're going to see this same language repeated. So evolutionary explanation of attachment is no different from other evolutionary explanations. It's using that same language. So we'll take each letter in turn, but I do think that SMACKY is a way of remembering, at least it's a trigger, right? There were 5 things, there was an S, right? What was the S? Oh, it was social releases. What can I remember about that? And I've known many students take that approach. The examiner doesn't need to know that's how you've remembered it, but they've taken that approach and it's allowed them to do really well on those outline questions. Okay, so S, social releases. Now, this is very clever, and it tells us, it paints a picture of our infants, our newborn babies, however cute they may be, as being really quite manipulative. Okay, so this idea, and these are all just ideas, aren't they? Remember, we've got the 2 big theories and they don't agree. We've got the learning theory on one side that tells us we have to learn how to form attachments, and that was the food. And then we've got this evolutionary theory coming off completely different branch, telling us that it's innate, we're born with it. So in this theory, Bowlby tells us that babies have physical characteristics, the cuteness, the chubby cheeks, everything about them that just makes people, especially women, but I'm not being sexist here, but there is something that just makes them go, ah, makes them want to care for the infant. So Bowlby says there's something that has evolved throughout these generations, throughout the history of evolution. It's evolved to mean that the baby has certain physical traits and characteristics, and the mother has something inbuilt into her that makes her want to respond. So it's kind of like this almost cuteness radar, where the mum wants to care for the child. It taps into. So the way a baby cries makes the mother want to respond. The way a baby smiles and has that cuteness of the face makes the mum want to nurture it. So Bowlby called these social releases, and examples would be crying, physical features, the shape of the face, the smiling. So it's 2-way. Remember, an attachment is a 2-way bond, and these social releases work 2-way. It's releasing in the mother an emotional response to a physical feature of the infant. And he says this is built into us. So this lovely newborn baby has already got built into it a mechanism to make mum care for me. Because remember, I need mum to care for me in order for me to survive. I can't feed myself. And mum needs me to survive to pass on her genetics to the next generation. Now, I know this makes it sound awful, doesn't it? It's bringing this lovely emotional bond between a mother and an infant down to something so crude and horrid. But remember, this is the evolutionary approach. So this is telling us that everything is about how we as humans have evolved to survive, to adapt best to the environment and to survive. So social releases. I'll explain, as once I've gone through each of the letters, I'll explain why I've chosen to present the diagram in the way I have. We also have M, monotrophy. Now, if you break down, mono means one, doesn't it? Think about monobrow. That's always how I remember it. I don't know why. Or monocycle, one. Monotrophy. Trophy is the bit that's about the attachment. So basically, monotrophy is this idea that we will form one main, most important attachment, which is why you'll catch me constantly referring to the mother. And you might be sat there thinking, God, Mrs. Sexist, isn't she? She's not really thinking about the fact that often it's the father who's an important figure to the child. I'm not being sexist or judgmental. What I'm actually doing is exactly what Bowlby did. And Bowlby's theory, and this is one of the big criticisms of it, Bowlby's theory told us that there was one main attachment that an infant made and needed to make in their early stage, in their critical period. And Bowlby's focus was always on that being the mother. Now, that's partly reflective of the time that he lived in. You know, that was the general assumption, that the mother was the main carer, nurturer, the one who would, you know, be at home raising the child. So it's partly reflective of that historical context, and we know attitudes and times have changed. But it's also because he thought you only needed one. So he didn't recognise the role of the father and the importance of that. And he actually didn't recognise those multiple attachments that Schafer and Emerson went on to talk about. Bowlby said you need one main attachment. You need to form that during your critical period. It's all about survival. In order to help ensure that attachment is made, the baby and the mother have those social releases. And that's how it works. So our S, social releases. Our M, monotrophy, one main important attachment. Our A, and why I've put it at the top of the diagram there, is because all of the rest sits underneath that, is just that word adaptive. Bowlby thought that this whole idea of forming an attachment was an adaptation. It was something we've evolved to do in order to aid our survival. And that's it. So the social releases are how we've adapted to ensure that we do form an attachment. The monotrophy, we only need one attachment. We only need one person to look after us, to provide us with food and to raise us in order to survive. So therefore, the adaptation is you put all of your energies into one main attachment. So everything else sits underneath that idea of adaptation. And if I was using Smacky as a little memory prompt in an exam question, I would write it in my margin in that order, because that's how I've remembered it. But I would probably start my answer by talking about how attachment is an adaptation and setting the scene of the evolutionary ideas. So words like innate and adaptation and survival would be coming in there. And you'll see that in a minute. So we then have our C, critical period. I mentioned it with Lorenz. Now with goslings, we were talking just a few hours, but with humans, we're talking 2 to 2.5 years. Bowlby recognised that was your critical period. If for whatever reason, and there's all sorts of reasons why an infant might be separated from parents, might not have the opportunity to form a secure attachment in their first couple of years, Bowlby said, if you don't form that attachment, monotrophic, one main secure attachment in your critical period, you've missed your chance and it will have fatal consequences. And we'll go on a bit later in the topic to think about his studies and what those consequences might be. So he thought the critical period was exactly that. It was the period in which it was critical, it was vital that you were able to form that attachment. And the last I is internal working model. Internal working model. This is that blueprint, and this is where it links with Lorenz's idea of imprinting. Okay, so our I in SMACI is internal working model, but actually it massively links with Lorenz's imprinting. So let's just pause, take a step back. Imprinting, what was that again? Think to yourself. That was this idea that those goslings, they imprinted, they put into their mind the image of Lorenz, and therefore they attached to him. Now, Bowlby thinks a bit more complex than that in humans, but he thinks our first, our monotrophic, made within the critical period, secure attachment forms a blueprint, a template in our mind for all later attachments. So Bowlby does recognise that we will go on and we'll have other relationships. Of course we will. We'll have other attachments. And he thinks that first one is the blueprint. So if that's poor, insecure, for all sorts of reasons, you won't be able to go on and have other secure, positive relationships later in life. Goodness me, we are condemning somebody to a series of unsuccessful relationships and attachments and parenthood throughout their own life based on their first attachment. There's a lot of people that won't like that, and that's one of the critical evaluative points again. But that gives you a flavour, and I chose to represent it in that diagram because it's all about how we've adapted, A. It's about the idea that we have one main attachment, and in order to get that one monotrophic attachment, it needs to happen during the critical period. We need the social releases, and it then forms our internal working model. And all of that is essentially a human equivalent of what Lorenz found with his goslings. So I said to you last time how critically important Lorenz's research is. It is, because without Lorenz we wouldn't have had Bowlby. Bowlby was actually a student of Lorenz, so he was very influenced by Lorenz's research and his work. And then along comes Bowlby and tries to apply it to human beings and comes up with this theory. Now, that word monotrophy, really important, because sometimes you will hear Bowlby's theory referred to as monotrophic theory. And a couple of years ago, I had a student really caught out by that in an exam because the question said outline Bowlby's monotrophic theory. And she panicked because she thought, oh my God, have we not done that? Monotrophic theory, I don't know what that is. I know Bowlby's evolutionary theory. It's the same thing. It's just because Bowlby put such emphasis on this one monotrophic attachment, sometimes that's the term that's used to explain it. Okay, so that's the theory, if you like, represented as that diagram, and we're remembering our letters, SMACI, okay, social releases, monotrophy, adaptation, critical period, internal working model. So what I would do if I were you is I would pause this, I would turn that into a flashcard, and I would take some time to start the process. We know it doesn't happen this quickly, but to start the process of memorising that and using that as a little memory aid, okay? You'll see then, not wanting to overcomplicate, but wanting to introduce you to some of these other words that we want to try and pack our answer with. You'll see that I've put the word innate on there at a couple of points. So think to yourself, right, what is innate? Inbuilt. We're born with it. So it's appropriate to use that language of our social releases being innate, we're born with them. For Lorenz, that ability to attach to the first moving object that the goslings saw was innate, and it aided their survival. So evolutionary theory, we know, is all about survival. And we know that when Bowlby talks about the monotrophic attachment, that first important attachment, it's vital, critical. and it's lasting. You'll also see I've put the term cognitive schema on there, because when you form that blueprint, remember that internal working model, when you use all of those experiences, emotional and physical and otherwise, of that first attachment, which Bowlby's assuming is with your mother, he says you're forming a schema of what an attachment is. You're forming a schema of what a mother is. You're forming a schema of what feeling loved is. And you'll keep coming back to that schema every time you are faced with a new relationship, friendship, attachment situation. So we can use terms that we've brought from our previous learning into this as well. Okay, so this is a task I'd like you to spend some time doing. And we've done something similar, I think. We did it with the cognitive approach, if I remember correctly. And it's really just a scaffold to help you to build up to what would be an exam question. Because we've got all of the words that I've just thrown at you there and that you'll have come across in your reading. And your job is to try and create a summary paragraph. We're not worrying about evaluating at this stage. We're building up to that. We are just sharing our knowledge and to incorporate all of those key terms. Remember, we don't want it list-like. I don't want Bowlby said it's monotrophic and adaptive and there's the critical bit. I don't want it list-like. I want this to be you showing off your knowledge. How do the ideas connect together? What's Lorenz's imprinting got to do with Bowlby's internal working model? Why do we talk about this? The word ethologist on there is somebody who used animal research. So Lorenz was an ethologist. So that's just something you can throw in, make yourself sound wonderfully clever. Okay, I think the rest we've already touched upon. So that's your job. And essentially, in doing that, I'm not going to ask you to do both things. Essentially, in doing that task and aiming to get 27 marks or points, what you're doing is answering a 6-mark question on Bowlby's theory of attachment. You're packing it in with all of that terminology. So I want you to do it as the points challenge and try and get 27 points and do me a really nice, thorough, explanatory paragraph. But if you can do that, then you can answer a 6-mark question. Okay? So again, you would pause the video and you would complete that as a task. The other final bit that I sort of want to conclude this lesson on, and then we'll move on again tomorrow, is obviously with any theory and with any set of ideas like we have here, we need to be able to evaluate it. Because you've just worked on a paragraph that would essentially be an outline question, 6 marks. But we know we could get a 16 marker, which asks us to outline and evaluate. Now that would be a gift of a question, because we remember Smacky, we unpack that, and that's our AO1. And then we evaluate, and we know that the best way to evaluate is to bring in alternative studies. And my goodness, are there some great alternative studies to bring in to evaluate Bowlby. So we can talk about how socially sensitive it is. Imagine I am somebody who, this is not true, but I want you to imagine I suffered severely with postnatal depression after I had my child. And I was in and out of psychiatric units and hospitals because I suffered so badly I was not deemed to be safe to take care of my child. But I sought the help I needed, I got myself sorted, I was maybe on antidepressants, and I was then, 2.5 years down the line, able to be much more secure and form an attachment with my child. Why might I find Bowlby's theory concerning, offensive, upsetting, insulting, all of those other words? Well, because he says, because I didn't form an attachment during the critical period with my child, I'm never going to be able to, and it's going to have terrible consequences for her or him. Now that's socially sensitive. And that's just one example of why somebody might feel that they are unable, that this theory is proposing that they're never going to have a quality relationship with their child. So it's socially sensitive, and we can explore that. There's a couple of names on there, Bailey and Brazelton, and we haven't touched on those yet. but in your textbook reading, you will come across them. And what I want you to think about is how you can use Bailey and Brazelton to evaluate, okay? And again, that might be something that you can just add to those notes, add to that paragraph you've just written. Schafer and Emerson, we have done. So the question you think to yourself is, how can I use Schafer and Emerson's research on the stages of attachment to either support or to contradict what Bowlby's saying? And the bit that really would strike me is monotrophy, because Bowlby says it's all monotrophic within the first 2.5 years. Well, Schafer and Emerson's told us that by a year old you've got multiple attachments and they're all equally important. So we've got a challenge, we've got a contradiction. Now we don't have to decide who's right, but we can certainly use one to challenge and contradict the other. And we can look at the strength of Schafer and Emerson's study as supporting evidence against Bowlby. And that's how you clock up those marks, and that's how you show the examiner you really understand this theory. So we need to start thinking about evaluating. Now we'll build on that in Friday's lesson, but for today, in terms of tasks, let me just recap what I'd like you to have done. Make sure you've read those pages in the textbook. Make sure you've turned Smacky into flashcards, and you may well have wanted to have used the diagram, the annotated diagram that I've used. Make sure you've done your points paragraph, aiming for full points, where you've incorporated all of that language to just generate your understanding on that and make sure you get it and you can link all of the ideas. And underneath your points paragraph, a couple of strengths and weaknesses, supporting and challenging evidence from those prompts there to help us start building on our evaluation. That's what I'd like you to have achieved by the end of Thursday. Remember, we need to think about lesson time plus a reasonable amount of homework time, but you should not be working way into the night to keep on top of this. And if you are, speak to me, because that is hard to judge. It is hard to judge how much you can achieve. Everybody works differently. I know the screen time is intense. So do please talk to me and say, Miss, I'm struggling. I need a bit of help with this. That is what I'm here for. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that, and I will see you. No, I'll not see you on Friday. It will be a pre-recorded lesson again on Friday, but I'll be on Teams and on email, of course, if you've got any questions. So just keep your eye out on Teams. Okay, thanks, guys. Take care.